Ich bin seit einiger Zeit
For a while now,
mir scheint,
I've
etwas verändert
pondered
hat
over
im
something.
Das
It seems like
Rechte Stimmen
something
umso lauter,
changed on the internet.
umso sichtbarer geworden sind.
Right-wing
Am
voices
deutlichsten fällt
have
mir
been
das auf
amplified,
Twitter auf,
and I
wo
really
ich merkte,
see that on
dass ich
Twitter,
immer öfters von rechten Accounts angeschrieben, auch angegangen werde.
where I can see that a lot of
Ich gebe ein
times
Beispiel
right-wing
für so
accounts
einen Tweet.
post at me, and I'll just give an example of one of these tweets here. A user explains to me, if you don't have anything better to do with yourself, why don't you just commit suicide? Another example, less strong. Here a user tells me that I'm a neck folder, basically. I don't think it's a German word even. And there's a picture with a quote from Karl Theodor Körner. You're still sitting up there, paid for by our enemies, scorning the people. But justice will return, and the people will judge you, so just hope for God's grace. And this quote is made up. There's no reason to believe that Körner actually said this. So with a word that doesn't exist and with a quote that's not correct, this user tries to prove his or her intellectual quality. But it's not just about content, it's also about the quantity of it. I really do feel that 5-6 years ago, there were far less of these right-wing users on Twitter. And so when I ask myself, is this just, my gut feeling, or is there something to this theory? And so I contacted a data specialist, Luca Hammer. He looked at the identity movement, die Identitäre Bewegung, a right-wing youth movement in Austria and Germany, and he looked at how many Twitter accounts were associated with well-known accounts of the identitarian movement. And he found that there were 19,000 accounts associated with it. And so when we look at what time these accounts were registered, we see that a lot of these right-wing accounts are just 1, 2, or 3 years old. This right-wing bubble on Twitter is really a new phenomenon. And we see more and more successful right-wing accounts that manage to claim a sort of territory on the internet. And when we look at these right-wing positions, there's definitely connections here. And what I'm interested in is, why are they so good at it? What are they doing right? Why are they so hip, at least within parts of online readers, of the populace? And so I'm going to talk about that, but I'm also going to propose some methods for countering these right-wing messages. And originally there was this different idea when we thought about public discourse on the internet. We thought that it would be more rational, grounded in facts. And to really show that that was the case, I brought an ad film from MCI, an internet service provider, from 1997. And back then they promised that gender and race wouldn't matter anymore on the internet. So yeah, I'm going to show this real quick. It's a bit controversial.
There is no race. There are no genders.
There is no age.
No age. There are no infinities.
There are only minds. Utopia? No. Internet. Where minds, doors, and lives open up. Is this a great time or what?
Utopia? No. Die Internet. Heute, 20 Jahre später,
Today, 20 years later, we're living in a world in which Donald Trump is President of the United States of America, in which in Germany the AfD, sitting in parliament with 12% of the seats, and in Austria the right-wing populist FPÖ is part of the government. It's wrong to see the internet as the cause for all of these things. The internet is not the cause why people feel attracted to right-wing nationalist ideas. There needs to be a societal basis for this. But it's not the case that the internet helped us overcome racism. On the opposite, right-wing actors are very good at using the internet. In their strategy for success, digital tools play a large part. I will today provide 3 explanations for this. The first one coming up. Right-wing strategies fit very well to the heated debate on the internet. And it's a property of right-wing rhetoric to incite emotion and incite anger. Discursive strategies of inverting the roles of victims and perpetrators, the use of scapegoats, belong to the necessary strategies of right-wing rhetoric. When an AfD politician calls all Turkish people camel drivers, or an Austrian politician says that all refugees should be concentrated in one place, these words force us to have an emotional reaction, and that is one of the recipes for success of the populists. Classic media jump onto statements like that, make them the topic, and thus give them more visibility. But even in the internet, this strategy is quite successful because this kind of statement causes more interaction than neutral statements. Timothy Ryan tested political ads on Facebook, and he saw that political ads that cause anger and rage on Facebook would cause more than twice as many clicks as than neutral ads. That means it is an effective strategy for parties to enrage people, get them engaged, and harvest clicks. It's only human for us to react emotionally, but on the net, there's a second factor coming in here, and that is technology. What we see is more and more determined by algorithms, and on platforms like Google and Facebook, the algorithm decides what individual users see and don't see. So we see that the strategy of right-wing populists fits this condition very well. We see that when a right-wing posts causes interactions, you see the 5 interaction and reaction smileys down here. It gets a lot of displays.
So this is all about outrage. And data scientists looked at the statistics and he saw that of all the German parties in the German Bundestag, the AfD got a lot more reactions than posts from other parties. And more than half of all reactions on AfD postings are anger. And so we don't know from that whether the people clicking on this angry emoticon are angry along with the AfD over some topic, or if they are angry at the AfD. But it's definitely the case that this technology is a factor for the success of right-wing parties. And so Facebook didn't provide access to researchers so far. They've announced that they want to be more open to researchers. Thank you. But technology isn't the only factor. The second reason, I really feel this myself, that I'm surprised at right-wing politics being so successful. And so I think there's a cognitive bias that when we look at modern technologies, we also think in terms of a modern society. But conservative right-wing users obviously look at these new technologies to promote their backwards agenda. And the most important example being the National Socialists. But there's also other examples. For example, the Ku Klux Klan in the US. They owned film production studios in the 1920s in order to produce movies that would promote racist thought. A sociologist from Hunter College told me about this. Her book is called Cyber Racism. And what I also learned from her is that this technology enthusiasm of the Ku Klux Klan was long-lasting. So maybe you've heard of David Duke. He was a grand wizard at a Ku Klux Klan organization, so their leader, and also a neo-Nazi. And in 1998, he posted on his website that he thought the internet would unleash a chain reaction of racist thought that would shake the world. So it seems like right-wing people are really into this sort of these sort of grand sentences. And so when we look at the ad that I just showed you a few minutes ago, that was about the same time as this David Duke post. And so at the same time, when we all thought that the internet would solve a lot of problems, right-wing actors try to use the internet for their political agenda. For a German-speaking audience, there's a new documentary out called Delete Yourself, Delete Your Account, Lösch dich in German, which shows how these new technologies are used to bring down people that disagree with you. And this really is a strategy of the far right to try to push out other points of view. And for us, it seems all right that there's an open discourse, but especially for a few young men, this sort of anti-mainstream stand, this is being sold as an act of rebellion, which is a genius trick by the far right. The far right tries to sell conservative ideas, traditional families, the nation state, as new ideas. And also the term new right is also a sort of marketing trick, because it's all about traditional conservative far-right thought. And this example I've mentioned, Reconquista Germanica, is just one of many. It seems like the identitary movement will launch an app soon. It seems that there's a prototype version for Android already. This is a smartphone app that's supposed to bring people who share the same opinions together. So there's a map, and you can see where there are users with who share your far-right thoughts, and then you can ping them and meet them up. And so this is supposed to bring people together to create a sense of togetherness. And this is branded as the app for the silent majority, which is funny because on the one hand, they claim to be the silent majority, but on the other hand, they need an app to, meet other people who think alike.
Mal schauen, wann und ob diese App wirklich kommt.
Let's see when and if this app really comes. You can be too afraid of such announcements, but it's very interesting how tech-savvy the new right are and how they suggest to their members that they are part of a gigantic movement. Those right-wing movements use online tools to suggest that they are much larger and more powerful than they actually are. But there's a third reason why the right is so successful online, and that is their endurance. In Austria, we've had right-wing populists in the parliament for decades, and the FPÖ has been the first party in Austria which had a real online strategy. For example, they introduced FPÖ TV in 2012, their own YouTube channel, and this is what it looks like. They don't have a lot of views, but that's not really what it is about. Since the introduction of FPÖ TV, the party sports their own media team, and those videos are broadcast mainly on Facebook to a giant audience. So the party started working very early on their own content to repeat and repeat their own narrative. And at the same time, the AfD in Germany is a very enduring party. As an Austrian, I think it's very fascinating to see how quickly the party has started a lot of accounts, how quickly they have adopted so-called instruments of counter-power. Other parties don't show the same level of stamina. They're quick to start a social media campaign just before elections, which was then discontinued just after the election. Case in point, Martin Schulz, candidate for chancellorship of the Social Democrats in Germany, who made quite a social media appearance around the elections only to disappear right afterwards. But it's not only about the media strategies, it's also about the political discourse. The right-wing populists moved the discourse in a way that the Green parties did in the 80s. We're not talking about the protection of the environment and trees anymore. We're now talking about the dangers of immigration and whether Germany is a Christian country. In this regard, I like to quote Elisabeth Wehling, who will be here tomorrow. And she's researching so-called frames, which is a theory that can explain the power of words. To briefly explain her thesis, when we as people hear a word, we understand this word in the context of a frame, which is contextual information that helps us understand a word. For example, if I tell you that the bird is in the sky, just think of that. There's a high probability that you imagined a bird with its wings spread in the sky. But this information is not in the sentence, if we're quite accurate. You just know from experience that when a bird is in the sky, it's flying. And when it's flying, Its wings are spread. Your brain just calls on a so-called frame, and frames are interesting in political discourse because they evoke a context and associations, and the more often you use such a frame, the stronger the connection gets. If you repeatedly hear refugee and criminal, you're prone to connecting these two terms. So right-wing populists are very, very strong in repeating their information, which means that probably most of you could imitate a right-wing politician right now. The opposing thesis, however, is quite hard to replicate because you don't hear it that often. For example, it's very often that you hear the question posed, how dangerous is political correctness? At the same time, a discussion on how important is political correctness is mostly silent. And that's a sign that right-wing frames have entered our societal discourse to quite an extent. The internet now is quite a powerful tool for using repetitions. There was quite an interesting paper in 2017, which seemed to be educational material for the identitarian movement, and they write, our political communication needs to reach the masses and be very accessible. At the same time, we do not wish to only reach the mainstream. We wish to subvert the mainstream. We wish to polarize to counter the narratives in the mainstream.
Dass Rechte mit Memes, mit unterhaltsamen Elementen der Netzkultur arbeiten, ist ein weiterer Versuch, die Debatte hijacken. Gerade über Bilder und über
in the course of that,
soll ein niederschwelliger
the right makes extensive use of memes to provide a low threshold access to right-wing thoughts. The motto of this year's Republica is pop.
Diese Popkultur sich anzueignen.
Memes are part of pop culture in the internet, and the right wings try to co-opt this pop culture in the net. And there's just no way that in a talk about how hip the right on the internet is, there's just no way not to talk about Pepe the Frog here.
So, to give you a primer, Pepe the Frog was a harmless comic figure a few years back, but through the use of his image by right-wing extremists in the US and in Europe, he was turned into a symbol for the far right. So, for example, this one as an SS officer in front of a concentration camp, or they showed him as Marine Le Pen or Donald Trump, until people associated this frog with this kind of politics. And so what really makes me think is the right-wing movement was able to coin Pepe's image as their own. But the left doesn't have that. There's no worldwide symbol for a liberal viewpoint. But yeah, be gone. And so some solutions too, because there's little time left. First, we need to talk about technology. Technology can be changed. So on Facebook, I can give all these reactions, haha, funny, angry, but I can't click on something called respect. And there's research by Natalie Stroud, a communication researcher, how the behavior of clicks is changed within online communities if there's not a like button, but instead a respect button. So, if users see a like button, they affirm the content they see, something they agree with. But if there's a respect button, then users tend to also affirm
Auch wenn ich ihn nicht unbedingt teile.
Opinions that they don't necessarily share.
Austausch eines einzelnen Wortes
And so this is
Nutzerverhalten ändern
really interesting that just changing one little word can lead to a huge change in user behavior.
und nicht das
And so that raises the question, how is technology supposed to be designed if we want to bring out the best in us and not the worst in us?
Rechte sind fleißig.
And the second point, we've seen that the right-wing movement is working very hard and very clever to share their viewpoint. But as I see it, the people who oppose right-wing politics, they sort of think that at some point they're going to win. And I've written a book, and I really want to make this point again. Just by using facts, you don't win discussions. Another example from France. Researchers gave out facts that were given by Marine Le Pen, and then afterwards they gave corrections, and so she changed numbers regarding refugees coming in over the Mediterranean Sea and claimed that most of them were male. But the United Nations organizations gave out their fact check. And so once people saw this fact check, of course they believed it, but if you first see the false claims by Marine Le Pen, and then afterwards the fact check, they still tended to believe Marine Le Pen a little more than if they wouldn't have seen her message at all. And this means that you don't just need better facts within political discourse, but also a way to spread it. And so I really think this is a weakness for democratic parties, that maybe we've gotten used to society becoming more and more open. Starting in '68, for example, women don't have to ask their husband anymore if they want to, take a job. And also homosexuals had more and more rights granted to them by the state in these past few decades. And so someone who's lived through that might think that that's just the way the world works, but that's not the natural societal progress. It actually needs work, and so that also means opposing right-wing thought. And so, because what the right wing also is trying to do is try to take back these progressive policies. And so, coming to a close, we see that trying to convince someone is always work, and we shouldn't just copy right-wing content and disprove it, but we should learn something from their persistence. Thank you.